Hello, everybody on the call and those joining on right now. Welcome to the Conservation Lands Foundation's Showing Allyship as Conservation Organizations webinar. We are very pleased to have all of you here. My name is Andres Esparza. I am the Grassroots Engagement Director here at CLF, and I'm joined by a bunch of my colleagues who you're going to be hearing from over the next hour and a half as we have some important discussions, talk about what it means to be an ally as a conservation organization, the difficulties that are in it, the ways that we have to show up both individually and as organizations. We'll have some poll questions, we'll have some time for Q&A, and this call is going to be recorded so that folks who can't make it or folks who need to see this afterwards can view this post-webinar. Again, thank you so much everybody for joining us. We realize that there is a lot going on in the world right now. Between pandemic, economic recession, and violence against Black and Brown people, and just general uncertainty, this is not an easy time. So if you're here joining us, we really appreciate it. And if you couldn't make it and you plan to watch this, we also appreciate that. And if you have to put it off for a few days because there are a lot of things piling up, we get that. That's totally okay. But we do appreciate you joining us because this is something that we are all talking about right now, directly related to the violence against the Black community and systemic racism in our country. And we as CLF realize we need to take a stand, and not just to the moment, but to the general attitude of how we've gotten here and what role we play in fixing it. So our webinar is going to focus on all of that over the next hour and a half. I have a couple really quick tech checks and general intros, and then I'm just going to hand it over to my colleagues so that they can continue on with this webinar. First off, in case you haven't already noticed, you all are muted upon entry. That's just to make this webinar really quick and easy and clean so folks can watch it later. However, if for any reason you need to be heard in the moment, what I would love for you to do is raise your hand. And if you can show me real quick as I'm talking, just find that button and click raise hand. I want to see like 50 alerts saying I raise my hand. And that is awesome. You're all doing it. Perfect. The next thing is you're going to see a Q&A box where you can ask us questions live. Don't worry about filling it in now, but just locate it. Towards the end of the webinar, we'll be asking for some open-ended questions and answers. Please use that box. As well, there's a general chat box. That's just for general discussion, either to any one of us or anybody on this call. So please use that appropriately. We'll be using that to facilitate some of our conversation as well. Again, raise your hand if you need to be heard. Otherwise, you're going to be muted just for clarity. Thank you. So as we dive into this, you know, it warmed my heart to see so many people sign up for an allyship webinar, knowing that everybody wants to be a part of the change that we need to see. And it really does, on a personal level, make me proud to know that we're all doing this together. Something that I realize is that it's not at all easy. And I woke up this morning thinking about this webinar, realizing that it's not easy for an organization to post a Black Lives Matter statement. There's a lot of reasons why it's not easy. There's a lot of problems with why it's not easy to do that. But what I would love for you to go into this webinar with and kind of hold the tension as we start talking about all this is, as hard as it is to come from a primarily white organization or hold some white identity and have to talk about allyship and all this, what I would love for you to really create some empathy around is that for Black and Brown folks in this community, it is unimaginably harder because they're not only having to respond to this, but they are living through it. And in that way, what I want you to do is take that tension of how hard this is and use that as passion to be a better ally and to take what we share today and everything else that you learn from this point on, so that when you're an ally, you're not doing it just because it's right, but you're doing it because it hurts so many other people. And you need to make sure that you recognize that it's hard for you, it's unimaginably harder for other people. And to be able to use your privilege to be an ally, to amplify the right voices for the right change is immensely powerful, but it has to come from a place of empathy. So I want to kick it off with that, just recognizing that it's not easy, but ultimately it's super important. Now, kind of have 3 goals for this webinar, and right after this, I'll share, I'll turn it over to my colleagues here. We want to do 3 main things. One thing is we want to normalize this idea of allyship, both within CLF and within the Friends Grassroots Network, but also in the broader conservation community. A lot of people are jumping on and saying, we need to do this, we need to be allies, and we absolutely appreciate that. But what we would love is for this to not be a discussion that we have to have with our board and our staff about do we not do it. We want this to be the norm. Supporting all of our communities should be baseline behavior. And we recognize that's a hard leap for a lot of people. So we're going to talk about that today. We're going to present some tools, best practices and resources on how to do it, how to start conversations, who to have conversations with, how to share appropriately, and things to do and then not to do. And then finally, kind of throughout all of it, which I think is probably one of the most important pieces, is we want to share our journey so far. And I think I really want our journey to shine through in this because we are not at all experts. We are fumbling alongside everybody else, but we are willing to put ourselves in front of everybody and show you where we fumbled so that we can all learn from CLF's mistakes and others and move forward in the most productive way. Our journey has not been easy, but we've all taken it upon ourselves to be a part of this journey in the best way possible. So normalizing allyship, sharing best practices and resources, and really talking about our journey in it, and knowing that we're willing to support anybody in their journey moving forward. And all throughout, again, saving time, especially at the end for some polls and some Q&A time, but also throughout, if there's anything that urgently needs to be heard, making time for that as well. So again, thank you so much for joining us. We realize this is not an easy conversation, but this is one of the most important things we can be doing right now. So thank you for setting aside this time. And with that, I'm just going to turn it over to Kris, our Senior Communications Director, to talk a little bit about the why.
Thank you, Andres, and good morning, everybody. Really happy to have you here and joining this conversation. We wanted to start, we think it's important to provide some grounding values or the mindset that CLF is bringing to this conversation so that we create the most appropriate space possible. And as Andre said, we recognize it may not be, or it may be uncomfortable for some and for different reasons, right? We each individually and as organizations are on different places of understanding. We're bringing different experiences to the conversation, and that's okay, because we all need to start somewhere. But where the Conservation Lands Foundation is, where we're coming from, is the belief on the following values. So we are operating under, we believe, that we as a society are operating under a white supremacy culture. And that's where white people are seen as better than people of color. And all of our institutions have been designed for the benefit and advantage of white people. So we're coming from that foundational understanding. And similar, where we find similarities with our work in conservation, as we all have embraced the mantra of, an attack on one monument is an attack on all, and that has what has really been a binding factor for us as a community. Similarly, for us, an injury and injustice to one person is an injury and injustice to all people. And that we're coming at this, that we want to build allies for the movement for culture change and not just for the moment. And so as you'll hear from us, and we hope to, hear from, you, that comes with, one step forward, a couple steps back. We're kind of making mistakes over here, but, we keep at it. And that just speaks to another foundational value and understanding, is that, there are no experts in this, diversity or building allies. It's ongoing work because we're all individuals bringing values to the table, bringing mindsets and biases to the table. So it's ongoing work, but we're in it and we are committed to do it because it can't be avoided if we're going to create the future we want. And so with that understanding, if we go to the next slide, we feel it's important, and what we've heard in conversations both within national coalitions that we're a part of, and then talking individually with some of the friends groups, is, setting the framework for why be an ally. So we want to make sure we're not jumping into the hows and the how to and how not before really getting grounding, or at least sharing our grounding at CLF on why do it. And these are among the key values that we hold on the why and what keeps us focused on the work. First and foremost is we believe that all people deserve to have access to and to feel safe and welcome on America's public lands. But because we live in a system and culture that discriminates against Black people and other people of color and privileges white people, we know that we're not there yet. And in recognizing, and I as a white woman am working on recognizing what I've been conditioned to understand is the world, but that it does privilege me and gives me advantages. And so as a white ally, and where we're focused at CLF is recognizing our privilege, checking it, and utilizing it to dismantle the racism that's embedded in the conservation community. And here we find it helpful, again, because everyone's on a different place of the journey, but wanted to provide some context for those who may be less familiar with how racism is just truly embedded in the culture, I'll say globally, but certainly within the US. And we're pulling here from some of the Avarna groups, research on colonialism. And so we're just going to hit some high points, but they're just important so that we're all going into this conversation with at least an awareness of where our do's and don'ts and the whys come from. And it's a recognition that European settlers colonized North America, and they did so under the beliefs of the doctrine of discovery and the manifest destiny, that they were destined religiously to be owners of this land, and that any land that they discovered was theirs for the taking. And as long as the inhabitants were not of their Christian faith. Anybody beyond that, or people of color, were considered wild and dangerous. And there was shifting beliefs around the land. It started from manifest destiny, and then it started being more towards a religious anchor, that believing that white people, the lands themselves, brought white people closer to God. And this was, shifting forward hundreds of years, this is how the basis of U.S. land management policy was formed. And the irony, as we can all see, is, it has, through time and through policy, actually disregarded the connection, the spiritual connection that Indigenous people, African Americans, and other people of color had to the land. It denied them their own spiritual connection. And so, there's been this colonial worldview that's dominated U.S. public land policy ever since. And that's just one microcosm, because we're in the conservation space, but this could be said of virtually all institutions, educational, policing, financial institutions. They're all based on this dominant, white dominant culture and advantage. And the one thing here that we want to continue to reinforce is we're not here to point fingers at anybody to say, you're a racist, I'm a racist. It's not that. It's understanding that we've inherited a system and we've been socialized to accept, to not even be aware, and to not question or therefore see our role in perpetuating these structures. But what is clear is that it will take white allies and people with that advantage to change that culture. It can only happen within the white culture to change it. We've heard, and this has happened to me personally, and people will say, well, this isn't important to me, or I'm not affected by this. And certainly in some conservation organizations may be questioning, where do I insert myself? Should we insert ourselves as an organization, a conservation organization, into this Black Lives Matter movement, the broader cultural change movement? And for CLF, we view it as inextricably linked with our mission. that it is mission critical, because there's no individual or organization that is separate from society, and therefore we're not separate from the racist structure that it's based on. And that as an organization, you know, we can only be successful if it includes everybody, all the people that it serves. And when we say includes, that includes on the decision-making process, reflecting them in how we reflect ourselves as an organization in terms of the voices and the pictures and the visuals we use and the values that we share. But we also recognize that as organizations, as a conservation movement, as conservation funders, everyone's on a different level of awareness and commitment and continuum. And so it's not to say that as you, as an organization, evolves its focus or its values to be more inclusive, to be better, we recognize that not all of our funders are there, right? And so we have to know that there may be a risk, but we view it as CLF. We want to be part of the leaders that are helping our funders get there. And some of the funders are out ahead of us and some are behind. And so we're committed to, as Andre said, you know, normalize what the expected behavior is. We know it won't happen overnight, but we want to elevate the network as a whole and support each other in that process. Because ultimately, you know, we talk about it being mission, not only is it mission critical or based on the values, but there is a growing external social pressure for all organizations. And as Elyane will share, you know, regardless of industry, regardless of organization, you know, there will continue to be this will be a growing factor in a group's, you know, social license to operate, how they're addressing this. And then the last 2 points we want to make here, and just, you know, the premise setting is a recognition that if we hold on to the old ways of thinking, that it really holds everything and everybody back. It will only serve to hold the conservation movement back, because it will sustain the racism that limits what we can accomplish. We're basically only using one part of our body, right? We've got a whole body of wonderful of cultures and perspectives that need to be added to the table, and we will all be so much better for it. And then finally, you know, the work is hard, it's uncomfortable. I can't imagine how it's like for people of color, but I know from my own experience it's uncomfortable in my own personal journey. But what I am grateful for is all of the resources that are available to me. We'll talk about some of those. I just finished reading White Fragility, which is a phenomenal eye-opener, and I think is going to be one of my Bibles that I'll be constantly referring to. But I have embraced, and what we're encouraging all of us to do is embrace the uncertainty, and don't let you know, the uncertainty of the process stop you from the progress, right? Don't let perfection be the enemy of good. It's like, just keep going. If we have our intentions and our hearts and the impact that we want to have in the right place, we're going to be better. So if you're making mistakes, you're making progress. Is what we try to enforce with each other, you know, at CLF. So, and then the last couple of points we want to share here is a recognition. You know, we've talked about, these are just some of the examples of how racism is embedded in ways that some of us may not have been sensitized to the way others have. And these are, you know, there's hundreds more. But as we're seeing, you know, in sharp focus over the past several weeks, racial injustice, police brutality, they continue to be used with apparent, you know, complete disregard of what's happening. The fact that it happens, you know, almost every day, outside of, you know, 3 weeks ago, the death of George Floyd, you know, it shows that it's truly embedded very deeply, and it is used to reinforce existing racist systems. And I think as much as we're going to be pushing to change the movement, we probably will see an equal pushback. And so I think we're in for, you know, challenging times ahead. Another way, you know, as Audrey's talked about, there's several crises taking place and converging right now. You know, with the outbreak of the COVID pandemic, we're seeing health disparities and disparities in crisis relief to communities of color, Indigenous communities, Black communities, Latinx, Hispanic communities across the country. We're seeing that nationally, the death rate for African Americans is 2 times higher than their population rate. And it's 3 or more times greater in some states. That the Hispanics and Latinx communities bear the burden of cases greater than their share of the population. And confirmed cases are 4 times greater in 8 states. Hopefully you've been seeing and watching so that you're aware of the crippling effects the pandemic is having in our Indigenous communities. And these are places, so not only are they affecting them disproportionately, part of that, the reason is because of the historical and generational lack of investment that we as a society have made to these communities. You know, the government has not stood up to their agreements with the Indigenous treaties to take care of the people on the land, provide them with healthcare resources. We're seeing up in the Western Arctic and Alaska, inability to get supplies. We know there's lack of fresh water here in the lower 48 among Indigenous communities. I mean, the list goes on and on. In New Mexico alone, Indigenous people make up 9% of the population and account for 60% of the COVID cases. So we're seeing in stark relief just what happens to these communities when they are not given the advantages, the investments that our white communities are given. And on top of that, you've got a workforce. Communities of color represent the large portion of frontline workforce, which is increasing their exposure to the pandemic. And these communities of color are less likely to have the jobs that allow them to work from home. So it's resulting in loss of wages, increased exposure, lack of infrastructure and support services. Is just creating a crippling effects for these communities. And that's on top of, that's just the latest, that's just 2020, let alone decades and generations of us, the toxic damage from environmental recklessness. And what we mean by this is recognizing that race, even more than class, is the #1 indicator of the placement of toxic facilities in the country. And we know that when you're close to these toxic facilities, there are higher rates of underlying conditions, heart disease, lung disease, diabetes. These communities lack the availability of affordable, fresh, and healthy food, and even fresh water in many communities, and the list goes on. But it's important to be reminded of this because many of us don't experience this on a day-to-day basis. We hear about it, we read about it, but this is generations in the making. And then on top of that, on top of generations, on top of COVID, we have the looming crisis. I say looming, it's actually existing now for many of us, is the impacts of climate change. And based on what I just described, those communities are the least equipped, and there's the least investment to be able to respond to or mitigate ahead of time the effects of climate change. We know that there's communities up in the Western Arctic that are going to be losing their homes to rising sea levels in the coming months and years. We're seeing extreme weather, droughts, flooding. It's just going to exacerbate the disparities if we don't accept it. And then the last piece that we want to reference, and then Elyane will talk about, ways to be a good ally, but we just want to set some limited view of the understanding of what the embedded culture that we're trying to change. One of the key things that has really stuck out for me, and think for us as an organization, is, and that gets reinforced, is our culture of, what we call bootstrapping, right? And this culture of strong individualism. And we have this narrative of the US story as being of, individualists over, taming the wild and taming the land. And not only is that disrespectful to the Indigenous people who know how to live in harmony with the land, but it obscures the fact that these obstacles that we're talking about and the racism is systemic, and that and that policies that are built off of those premises, right, continue to reinforce it. And so then it's left people to feel like, well, if I can't change it myself, then obviously something's wrong with me. And what we're here to do is to help build a larger movement to get right at the systemic changes that are needed and the policies that are built to support them. So we need to get over this strong individualism mindset and into one of a movement and collaboration, because that's how we're going to tear down and dismantle these systems and lead with our values. And with that, I'll turn it over to Elyane.
All right, thank you so much, Kris. Can you go to the next slide, please? All right, so allyship, what is allyship? There are a lot of really good resources out there, and this one, which is the Guide to Allyship, I felt really resonated, and it's straightforward. And see, these are some of the tips that I've learned from that guide. So to be an ally is to take on the struggle as your own. It means to stand up even when you feel scared. It's about transferring the benefits of your privilege to those who lack it. Acknowledging that even though you feel pain, the conversation is not about you. You also must be willing to own your mistakes and to decenter yourself, and understand that your education is really up to you and no one else. I also want to reiterate that being an ally doesn't necessarily mean that you have to fully understand what it feels like to be oppressed, but it means that you're willing to take that struggle on as your own. And that people who are oppressed don't get to put that oppression or the feeling of oppression away on any given day. They live with it every day. And being an ally means that you're willing to take on that weight every single day as well. And I really think that this applies to individuals and organizations. I'll also note that we have a nice long list of resources that we'll share with you all after the presentation. Next slide, please. Okay, so more on allyship. The do's. I'm just going to read through this because I think they're really important. Do be open to listening. Do be aware of your implicit biases. Do your research to learn more about the history of the struggle in which you are participating. Do the inner work to figure out a way to acknowledge how you participate in oppressive systems. And do the outer work to figure out how to change those oppressive systems. Do use your privilege to amplify, of course digitally and in person, historically suppressed voices. Do learn how to listen and accept criticism with grace, even if it's uncomfortable. And most likely it will be. And do the work every day to learn how to be a better ally. I'll emphasize too that this is a journey. It doesn't end. It's a journey that will continue. Next slide. The don'ts. Do not expect to be taught or shown. Take it upon yourself to use the tools around you to learn and to answer your questions. Do not participate for the gold medal for the Oppression Olympics. You don't need to compare how your struggle is just as bad as a marginalized person. Do not behave as though you know best. Do not take credit for the labor of those who are marginalized and did the work before you stepped into the picture. And do not assume that every member of an underinvested community feels oppressed. Next slide, please. Now, if you think about how your organization can be an ally, I want to share a list of best practices that we've developed. And of course, there are many resources out there, and I'm sharing our experience as an organization. And as Kris noted and Andres noted, we're not perfect. Our journey has not been perfect, but we're doing our best to share with you what we've learned, and we'll continue to learn and share what we learn. But do the work to understand why your organization wants to be an ally and how it will adjust to its how it will adjust its thinking and operations to be one. This will most definitely require a shift in organizational culture, and of course, therefore an investment to understand how your organization's values, behaviors, and practices foster bias, oppression, and racism. And then further investment to figure out how to dismantle those biases so that you can create a culture that is inclusive and allows staff to bring their full selves. On a personal level, something that I really appreciate about what we do at Conservation Lands Foundation is that we've elevated leadership within every staff person, so that everybody's voice is heard, no matter your job title, no matter the hierarchy within the organization. And I'll share two examples too. Just recently, one of our colleagues brought forth a book that she had recently read. And it's a book that you may have heard of, but it's called Decolonizing Wealth by Edgar Villanueva. And Erica, this individual, had read this book just for her own journey in becoming an ally, and brought it to us, and it became a required reading for the organization. And we had multiple discussions around what we learned in the book and how it can apply to our work and becoming a better ally in this work. Next slide, please. So a few more on best practices. Of course, make a commitment and then take action. Create an action plan, and definitely build in accountability. And I'd say this accountability is most important at the leadership level as well. Because to build trust is to be honest about what you can and cannot commit to doing. Listen to and engage with staff and the communities that you serve. And talk about and think about how you hold white staff accountable and how you support staff or volunteers or board members of color.
Do you have headphones on?
No. And also have the conversation about whether or not your staff and board and the organization as a whole reflect the demographics of the communities you serve. And if they don't, look at and listen to and engage with those communities to figure out ways that you can better serve them. And of course, don't appoint people to speak on their behalf, but really bring those people to the table. Create leaders within your organization so that they are there to speak for themselves and make decisions for themselves. And again, as Kris mentioned, don't let the uncertainty of the process stop you from progress. And I'll also note that you are not alone in this. We've been on this journey for a few years, and we're still learning and changing and shifting things as we go along. So what does being an ally actually look like? I'm excited to share a few examples here, and it's been really exciting amidst all of the gloom and the devastating news over the last few weeks. But it's been really refreshing to see how organizations have really stepped up in these last few weeks. One organization that I was really excited to read what actions they plan to take is Ben & Jerry's. And mind you, they're an ice cream company. They're a for-profit company. They also do some grant making and work in the conservation space. But they would be just fine if they continued being an ice cream company and continued to make delicious flavors. Nonetheless, they've used their privilege and their platforms and their networks to to speak up for justice and to fight for justice. And I'll read their quote here if in case there are folks on the phone. But this is a quote from a statement that they made a couple of weeks ago. Unless and until white America is willing to collectively acknowledge its privilege, take responsibility for its past and the impact it has on the present, and commit to creating a future steeped in justice, the list of names that George Floyd has been added to will never end. We have to use this moment to accelerate our nation's long journey towards justice and a more perfect union. You can Google their statement online, but their statement was titled, "We must dismantle white supremacy. Silence is not an option." They go on to call on 4 action items that were clear and steps moving forward and how we can dismantle racism. They first call on the president, elected officials, and political parties to take a formal process of healing and reconciliation. And they call on the president specifically to disavow white supremacists and nationalist groups. They also call on Congress to pass H.R. 40 that would create a commission to study the effects of slavery and discrimination and come up with recommended remedies. And they also support the creation of a national task force to draft bipartisan legislation aimed at ending racial violence and police accountability. And lastly, they call on the Department of Justice to reinvigorate the Civil Rights Division as a defender of rights of Black and Brown people. The second quote that I'm sharing with you all is one from Bill Dole from Archaeology Southwest. And his says, "If all that beneficiaries of white supremacy do is publicly proclaim that Black lives matter, but don't address our own selves and how we perpetuate racism, then we risk becoming the silent witnesses at the execution." Nonprofit organizations are vehicles for change. Sometimes change must start as personal change, and this seems to be one of those times. And then, of course, the Sierra Club, who has been standing up for Black Lives Matter for a few years. "We all deserve to thrive in safe communities, yet the inhumane daily assaults on Black and Brown people directly threaten our ability to maintain a healthy planet. The cruel public lynching of George Floyd is unacceptable and will not be tolerated. We cannot expect to come together to protect the planet if racism continues to tear us apart." And I share these quotes with you all because these are three organizations who state their why. They commit to taking action. And as you can see, they're all in different places in their journey to becoming an ally or to be an ally. And that's okay. Our journey, CLF's journey, will look much different than your organization's journey to be an ally, just as my personal journey has looked very different from Kris's or Andres's. Yet nevertheless, to acknowledge this and to make a statement and commit to taking action is still critical to the movement. Next slide, please. And so now on to what CLF has been doing. I mentioned that we've been on a journey to embed equity and justice in the organization since around 2015. But really, and honestly, only until recently as December, have we actually discussed what being an ally really means. In earlier days, we talked a lot about collaboration and working with partners and working with communities. But being an ally takes it so much deeper. And it really gets to a lot of these issues around how to dismantle racism and how to normalize this conversation. So hopefully you've seen some of what we've been doing externally, from offering program relevant to allyship, equity, inclusion, and diversity at our rendezvous gathering, through our Grassroots advancement program and our webinars. Last year, we hosted an Indigenous advocacy gathering. We've also formed an affinity group for Black, Indigenous, and people of color within the Friends Grassroots network. And we continue to invest in organizations working to create an inclusive movement within the conservation community. We've also created a COVID-19 relief fund for our Indigenous partners and working to create a space to discuss African Americans' relationship with the outdoors. And this event, which you see in this photo here, this year's event will take place tomorrow on Juneteenth, which is African American Emancipation Day. And our recent commitments related to Black Lives Matter include using our social media platforms and privileges to amplify voices of African Americans, Indigenous leaders, and other people of color. We are fully committed to listening and continuing to educate ourselves to better understand our privileges and the role we play to realize justice for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And we will continue to take action by advocating for policies that bring equity, justice, and improve access to the outdoors, and collaborating with communities to figure out how we can best support them. The other side of this, which you might not see as much, is the work that we've been doing internally. And our leadership and staff have been intentional about creating a culture that is inclusive and celebrates the leadership of all staff, no matter the job title. We've invested time to build the systems and structures to embody this work, from staff-led and facilitated discussions, management trainings, required reading of, as I mentioned, Decolonizing Wealth and White Fragility, and updating our organizational values. And I'll also share that we've had to turn down sign-on letter requests in the last couple of weeks because they included commitments that we knew we couldn't uphold, or because we knew the organization just hadn't yet had the discussion around our position on a certain policy or on a certain issue. And that's okay, because when we make a statement and we make a commitment to taking action, we really want to make sure that we can fulfill that commitment. And I feel that's a huge part of being an ally, is saying something, but also committing to take that action and being intentional about that, following through and holding ourselves accountable to realizing those commitments. So as you all dive into your journey, it will look much different, as I mentioned, to CLFs, and it'll look much different on an individual level compared to an organization's level. But hopefully by now, we all share the understanding that this shouldn't stop us from trying, because if we don't change, and if we don't stand for justice, there will never be an outdoors for all, and there will continue to be more George Floyds, Ahmaud Arbery's, Breonna Taylor's, and Christian Coopers. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jocelyn and Andres to facilitate our discussion. Thank you all.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to switch us over here to the polls that Andres had talked about earlier. For those folks who don't know me, my name is Jocelyn Torres, and I'm the field director here at CLF. So we wanted to turn the conversation a little bit over to you. We'll get to the Q&A, but really trying to create a baseline here for the network on what types of conversations are you having with your colleagues, exploring within yourself. Were you doing this before these current events, or were these current events the trigger for those conversations, right? And who is involved? Is it staff? Is it leadership? Is it your board? You know, does it extend to your members? And the goal of this really is to help us create more of these webinars, more of these trainings, and tailor those to things that are helpful to all of you. And so I will let Andres launch this poll, which has these 3 questions. And we'll give folks a few minutes. And these are, of course, questions from us to you, and you can still use the Q&A feature to ask us questions that the team can help address here in the next few minutes. All right, we're gonna give this another 30 seconds, and then we're gonna have Andres close this poll for us. All right, I think we're ready to close this up and see some results. All right. So the first question we asked all of you is your organization having conversations about race and equity? I'm so happy to see 98%. So yay, round of applause for everyone for having these conversations. As we know, that's the first step. As many of my colleagues have mentioned earlier, you know, you can't do the action plan and you can't work towards change if you're ignoring the problem to begin with. All right, number 2, were you talking about this before these current events? We have a yes in the majority, which again, yay, hand clap for everyone. But we should celebrate the steps in our journey. And not just, you know, beat ourselves up because we haven't met, you know, the ultimate outcome of the plan or holding ourselves accountable. We should celebrate every step. That's great. And then who's been invited to these conversations? We're looking at staff as the majority, a good chunk of board members, leadership, and then members having the smaller percentage. And I think that's pretty normal. it follows the journey definitely that we at CLF have taken. You kind of have to get your house in order internally before you start expanding conversations, right, and leading conversations with members and supporters. So great. All right, we will close this results of these polls and get us to the next piece, which is an open conversation for all of you. Please use the chat box to write in your answers. What fears are holding your organization back from, and I can't read the whole question, taking action toward social justice actions? So if you want to just use the chat box here to type in maybe some things that are holding you back. Is it lack of training? Is it being able to prioritize it within your organization? What is that thing holding you back? And you know, if there's a way that we can be helpful with that fear, type that in the chat box too. We'll be able to collect all of these and pass it over to the team and to Andres specifically to be able to build out some materials moving forward. All right. Being very conservative. Original mission. Not having bandwidth. I know we deal with that issue as well. Not knowing how to execute plans. Losing membership and revenue. Definitely. Not understanding, lack of training. All right, lots of good answers here. Yeah, so I think lack of training, there's a whole lot of resources that we'll be sharing with folks here. I think some of the other ones may get a little more complicated, and I'll open it up to my colleagues here on maybe some of the funding questions and the fear, you know, of losing funding or losing membership support, which folks depend on definitely for monthly donations or other things. I don't know if Elyane or Kris, you have anything to add there for folks, or Andres?
I might kick it off, and this is more of an abstract idea, but I think it's in the spirit of what we're going after here is, and again, Elyane, Kris, follow up and add anything, but we understand the fear of why it's scary to be out front on anything, especially something like posting a Black Lives Matter statement. Puts us in front and very visible on something that unfortunately has become political and divisive. And we get that. You're going to have people react in one way or another. And if you're relying on just a few foundations for funding, that's a scary place to be. We get that. But stepping back for a moment, try to imagine what it would be like if, again, this was the norm, and if the entire Friends Grassroots network and conservation community, as a normal action, responded appropriately and said, this will not stand. All of a sudden, what happens is you're going to stand out if you don't respond to these things. If you can create a culture where this is what we do, those who don't are showing that they don't support it. And what that does is that tells funders, you're not going to get to cherry pick based on what's the most comfortable. If the entire conservation community is driving the funders, all of a sudden we dictate what a just future looks like within, you know, everything else that we get to do. And you don't have to worry about being out front, because being out front in this way is expected behavior. And I realize that's not a fix for tomorrow or even next year, but that's something to work towards. Not having to feel like you're out front in a conservative community. Instead, you're just doing this regardless of what community you exist in. But I do want to turn that over to Elyane and Kris or any of the other questions, realizing that it's not an easy transformation, but it is kind of the transformation that we see going forward.
Yeah, if I would add one other component to that, it's the recognition that this isn't like a light switch moment where, you know, it's more of a set what your values are, or what you want the organization values to be, and how is that going to manifest itself. at the same time, recognizing, and I see from some of the chat comments that there are your immediate constituencies and funders, you know, might be, to stereotype, you know, all white, all conservative, and that has historically been, and that is the case now. And so it may be that putting a Black Lives Matter statement is not your immediate next step. But to Andres' point is, there are steps to be taken. You can, you know, you may not be, because the other value that we've talked about at CLF is we're stronger together. So we don't want some organization to lose its funding immediately because they've gone out kind of over their financial skis, you know, on this point. It's more of helping to bring yourselves, the organization, and therefore your funders, and therefore the larger community along, or be among those that are helping to normalize this. And at some point, it will be a risk, but we believe that it will be normalized such that you might lose, and I say we, CLF, you know, if we lose a funder based on our values at some point, it opens the door to pick up other funders as well. So to not think of it in the dichotomy of either or, it's this or that, you know, part of the whole construct that we're opening up to and working to change is that either or, you know, it's yes or no, it's good or bad. It's like, it's all things, you know, when we elevate when we elevate communities of color, we elevate ourselves. Now, a lot of predominantly white or conservative communities aren't there yet. And I think we need to give all of ourselves a, you know, the comfort that you have to find, you know, what is right. Now, we're not suggesting that this all has to be comfortable for white people, because it isn't and it won't be. And that's part of the problem. That's what we need to change, but also recognizing as an organization that your progress could be on a different timeline and looks differently. But we are hopeful, and that we want to be here as an ally to help all organizations, no matter what constituency they have or funders that they have, be headed in that direction. And we believe that there are pathways to do it.
All right. And I would add too, I think from a programmatic perspective, if the organization really looks at the communities that they serve and really the demographics of the county and the city and the places that surround the public lands that you're working to protect, most likely there's more diversity than maybe you or others had thought initially. And if you think about creating space and creating programs that benefit all of the community members, you could be looking at really different values than what you had historically had.
I would, before we move on to another poll question, I've seen this come up a couple of times, but the fear of mission creep, and I think Kris hit this early on her presentation, but we came very early on to the realization that we cannot accomplish our mission until all people are included in the decision making, right? Even just in individual units at the Bureau of Land Management aren't a part of the larger community that is taking care and stewarding these places. If it's just a percentage of the population, then we've not necessarily met our goal. But I'll also, again, open it up to my colleagues if there's more there that we want to share, and how we've navigated that maybe with board members, or maybe Kris from a communications perspective.
Yeah, I can use communications as an example of how we're integrating this. And Elyane has been a leader in our organization to take equity, inclusion, and access out of its own kind of area, bubble. And now it's included and a requirement of all of our work plans. From a communication standpoint, I have included and have requested and frankly needed, because we are such a small staff, needed the support of team members. And you're looking, all of them are here, are part of a de facto communications operation, but it's important to how we reflect what we say, the types of voices that we showcase, even to the how our visual representation. So we've got a, Friends Grassroots Network celebration video that you may have seen through the course of some events that we do. And like two examples, that's one example. And the beauty of that is that it's not as if we had to go out and say, oh, we want to make sure there's people of color in that. It actually, we were just pulling from all the activities and resources and everything we had. I think we were all gratified to see that is the reflection of our community. And secondly, even a small thing, but it was important to me, even in the deck that we've done, and I had a hand holding the tree on the Y to do the allyship work, and it was a black hand or black arm. And I don't know about you all, but I think for what I have seen historically in my career, and it is there's usually typically all white references, right? Emojis at first were yellow or white. You know, we have, you know, the concept of religion and what those architects, you know, look like. And so even in how we represent a general human experience and using people of color and all, you know, colors to showcase that, that's part of normalizing. And so instead of showing a white hand, showing a black hand, instead of showing a little, you know, white child, showing an Asian, or, you know, I mean, so it's even in those little things, they reinforce that we are talking about an inclusive community. But I will say, someone brought up in the chat that the other side of this coin to me is when if you have someone brought up, you know, having a mostly or predominantly white male leadership or an organizational culture or external audience, one of the things that also can be helpful is finding someone that looks like that audience who can then help them lead the way, right? So they're connecting with someone who they feel that they can relate to. So you're connecting with them at their level, and then we're bringing them along. And so don't be, you know, there are white allies, and use those white allies to help communicate, you know, kind of break down the fear, break down anxiety, you know, use your white allies to bring the other white community with you.
And I'll add one quick thing. Thank you for that, Kris. I'll add one quick thing to the mission creep statement, because I think that is important. And it's just a quick reframing of that. And you can do it in your head, or you can just literally stop the meeting and go to a whiteboard. But if you ever hear the word or the phrase or the idea, is this mission creep? Immediately flip that and say, what is it about this course of action that would enhance our mission? And what are the potential drawbacks to not doing this? And I think if you remove the word mission creep, which has this negative bias and automatically puts us in a defensive mode, but instead frame a new course of action as, how does this enhance our mission? And what are the drawbacks to not doing it? All of a sudden you realize that a lot of these things are actually mission critical. We just haven't been framing them that way. So you can do this in your head, you can do it on a whiteboard, but the next time you hear it, literally stop and take the time. And I think the reframing will really be helpful for moving forward.
All right. Well, I'm going to move us along here to our next poll question. Have you participated in an allyship training or trainings before today? We'll move on this one quickly because there's only one question. All right. Hopefully everyone answered that. Give it like 10 more seconds, and then Andres is going to close the poll for us. All right, let's see the results here. All right, no, so welcome folks to the first training. And thank you for answering this honestly. I think it's helpful for us to know where we're starting from. And making sure that we're maybe not skipping over concepts or language that might be helpful to all of you in this journey. All right, so we're gonna keep moving here to just give you all enough time to ask some good questions at the end. I think some of you maybe started answering this in our last chat box question, but what resources would be most helpful to you or your organization right now? I know earlier we've offered Kris up for some office hours to help with statements. We've had, obviously, this webinar. We've had other webinars in different trainings, like with the Avarna group at Rendezvous. But yeah, feel free to put in the chat box anything that you think might be helpful to you right now. And this will help us again to build out some programming over the next several weeks and just know how we can allocate our time in building resources for all of you. So it looks like training, board engagement, some examples of goals, resource list. The resource list is coming. We've started to build that out and we'll share it as follow-up materials. JEDI or DEI plans. I think there may be some templates there we can share as well. The resource list also has books, it has podcasts, it has movies, TV shows, articles. So any way that you learn, also being inclusive of people's learning styles. I know we all learn differently, so we try to provide as many resources there for folks. Great, guidance for organizations, marketing materials.
And while folks are adding things, I'll kind of add on to what Jocelyn was talking about. You know, we get to do a lot at the Conservation Lands Foundation, and the department that I get to work with is the Grassroots Advancement Program, which is where we do these capacity building resources that I like to think of as two ways. One is general, broad level webinars, resources that we share out openly, like this one, where everybody joins in and we're having a very open discussion, kind of setting a new baseline or talking at an established baseline. And what we realize is that folks are often in very different stages and aren't always at the same place. And I bring that up because we also like to work individually one-on-one with organizations. While we may not have the capacity to work individually with all 80 organizations in our network at 100 hours each, we are happy to connect you with experts, connect you with resources one-on-one, so that it's not just a webinar that you attend, but it's being able to email me directly, andres@conservationlands.org, and ask me specific questions, and for me to be able to connect you with my colleagues or other outside experts so that you're getting that one-on-one as well. So again, just keep that in mind, that we'll put everything we have on our website and in these capacity building opportunities, but we're also people that you can come talk to and ask, bounce ideas off of, because reading a fact sheet is one thing, bouncing an idea and brainstorming an idea is often a whole nother thing, and we're happy to do both.
Yeah, and before I move us on here to the next question, I do want to say we have an FGN Slack channel that we've created. We'll make sure to send the link for folks to join in the follow-up as well. But you know, there's 80 organizations all on different journeys. So obviously we can use peer-to-peer learning as well. And the Slack channel is a perfect way to ask a question and have, you know, other folks share maybe resources or materials that they've run into, so that there's a larger collective brain power there, and not maybe just the things that we on our small team ran into. All right. Well, the next question here for the chat box is sharing an organizational and personal commitment, just kind of one of each that you maybe picked up from today that you said, oh, I'm going to put a pin on this and make sure I bring it to my next staff meeting, or, you know, oh, I heard Kris mention white fragility. I'm definitely going to put that on my summer reading list. Just sharing here maybe one of each that you're making a commitment to achieving racial equity. And again, we'll be able to get all of these, so we can type in some collective goals as a network on what we'll all be working on here. And I'll let folks think about that one a little bit, and type those in. Also, I mean, this is really for your own personal commitment, right? It's put it on your to-do list for both your organization and yourself. All right, we're getting some in here. Work to address implicit bias, reading, listening, learning.
And Jocelyn, as you're reading those, somebody typed in real quick, as you're typing in stuff into the chat, see if you're typing it just to the panelist or to panelist and participants. If you're not typing it to panelist and participants, only us as panelists are seeing these. And I realize that the information that's flowing out of here is super useful and people might want to see it in real time. But also know that in the follow-up email that we send out, you're going to get all of this. So you'll be able to follow this in the follow-up. But if you want people to see what you're typing, make sure you're sending it to panelists and participants, please.
Thank you for the tech support there. Now we're all still learning Zoom and all the various intricacies of chat boxes and Q&As and polls and all that comes with it. And I would say too, if you're maybe struggling, I know I sometimes do towards the end of the week with adding more on what should I add to my to-do list. The resource guide, I think, will also be helpful in IDing some ways that you can make a personal commitment, right? If it's, I don't necessarily know which book or what podcast to listen to, you might find that on the resource page. And I would say there were also materials for children. So there's opportunity to do that as a family where, you know, you can commit to reading, you know, a book about race with your family and make that, right, your commitment for the week and include everyone and spend some time together learning. Right, a lot of good stuff here. And I want to make sure we get time for questions, so we'll make sure to type these all up and share them with folks. And our last one here, this is a poll question. Does your organization have a follow-up action plan to inclusion, equity, and access? Right, do you plan to address these? Do you have a plan that you're following? Do you not have a plan? You don't have a plan, but after today, you're ready to build one out with, you know, a simple to do for your organization and a simple to do for yourself. This one hopefully should be easy to answer. So we'll give it like 10 seconds and close this out. And while we're doing that, just thank you all for participating in the poll questions. It's super helpful for us to have a better understanding of where you all are on this journey and being able to really tailor information that we provide out to fit your needs. So a lot of no, but we will. So that says to me, maybe it would be helpful to share some action plan templates with folks in the follow-up. And if you do need one or need help, obviously navigating to that, please feel free to reach out. And there are definitely various type of templates, but I know we've used one ourselves in CLF to keep track of our action plan and accountability around that. Great. Well, then we are going to turn it over to you in Q&A. And we have the 4 folks you've seen. We also have Berta and Marisela and Beth hanging out in the panelist space. If there are other questions that maybe the 4 of us can't answer. And hopefully you've used the Q&A box that Zoom gives us, and there's some questions for us to start answering. I will hand it over to Andres to moderate this part of the questions.
Sure. Yeah, I don't see any questions coming in yet. So as you think of questions, feel free to type them in that Q&A box. I do see one that might have come in, Jora, on the chat. I'm assuming this is a question. Can you share how your staff reading list works and how FGN organizations might be able to use it? And I think that's fantastic. I think, to be totally honest, it's starting. I think what happened is Elyane referenced that one of our coworkers, Erica, read this fantastic book about foundations and power and money and the history of it in the US. And we said, that's awesome. Let's all read it and let's talk about it. It was very organic. And from that, we realized, wow, there's a lot of power in this. We're going to make this more formalized. And the next book, White Fragility, is a structured CLF buys everybody a copy. We set aside time in our staff meeting and we make time to talk about it and read it. And it's not something you do on the side. it's part of work. I could have sat at my desk and read it for work, and that would have been fine. And I think making that time as an organization was key. We are happy to share our list. We're going to share a lot of resources in that resource library that Jocelyn referenced. But more importantly, and kind of going back to that Slack idea of using Slack to stay connected, we don't have all the resources. We have the resources that we've found, but the reason we operate in a network is that a network's knowledge is greater than any one organization. And we would love to make this a two-way street where you share resources with us and we amplify them throughout the network, because then it's not just coming from us and we're removing ourselves from that power position, but instead we're a conveyor of the information that needs to be shared. So we will share our resources, but we also want to hear what books you're reading, what media you're ingesting, and share what's appropriate out to the network. Let's see, Grace had a question. How to deal with individuals or partner orgs who are racist, maybe intervention training? So like, not just like the subtle unconscious stuff, but like the outright, how do you deal with it? And I'm gonna turn this to maybe Kris, because I think a way that this shows up a lot, and I mention it because specifically our groups have mentioned it, is online with the media that you put out and the reaction you get on Facebook or Instagram or elsewhere. Sometimes that's how that reaction comes, is from that external audience responding to something you put out on media. And Kris has thought about this a bunch, and I'd love to hear Kris's reactions on how do you deal with racist reactions in external media.
Yeah, and maybe I'll do both, because I was actually thinking of it as internally in an organization or boards or partners that are in a larger community in an interpersonal way. But yeah, one of the things so from a social media standpoint, using that as an example, when it's just coming more anonymously, we always, there's two factors. One is, you don't want to engage, we will not engage, our social policy is to not engage with trolls or with people, like we're not going to spend our airtime with unproductively, right? And so if there's one comment, we're going to let it slide. If it's completely egregious and, out of the realm, we'll probably turn that person off. When we feel that it can be a productive opportunity to not necessarily change that person's mind, but to use that as an entry point to do two things. One is show leadership or show others that there is a responsible way to engage, and it is our responsibility morally based on our values to engage, to show that we can have a conversation about where our values stand. And it's important that we do it in a very respectful way. Like, we don't call people out individually, but what we do is start from a place of where our values are. At CLF, we believe, right, and then I would go through what our values are that I did at the beginning of this webinar. We believe that an injustice to one is an injustice for all. Our mission cannot be achieved, and our policy of protecting public lands cannot be achieved until all people of color and otherwise feel safe and welcome in public lands. So we will start from where our values are. And then, so then people can disagree on those values, but it's not a personal reflection, and I'm not calling anybody out for having racial bias or things like that. Similarly, I would say within an organization, because in the office hours that I held last week, we have some conversations around, from companies to small organizations, or, there's challenges around staff in some instances there's greater diversity among staff, there's a greater diversity of voices in those decisions at the staff level, but not yet at the board level, or not yet at the executive level. And the two things I would suggest to begin that process is, one, if there are resources, to actually bring in a third party to help conduct those conversations, so that it's not a staff versus, that power structure isn't there, but that you're able to bring someone in a third party to start introducing a new reality. Because for many people, it is a new reality, and it gets to an individual. Then it's not about us as an organization, it's about how we individually experience our world, and you're changing my worldview. But outside of that, I think the organization and people within the organization you can make great strides when you start teasing apart those values again, and not just making it personal, but it's more of if we believe as an organization that all people should be welcome to the outdoors, okay, let's start from there, right? So then you don't have to call anybody out. You don't have to make, because it's not our job to make people comfortable or uncomfortable, but also recognizing if you have leadership who is uncomfortable, they're not going to be listening. So it's like take this, the smaller steps to bring them forward so that we're all kind of dealing with our level of humanity and the level of values rather than making it personal, like you're a racist, for example. And part of that I have found in my own journey and talking with my white friends or family members, when I put it in terms of my experience and my values and say that I know that I am a racist because I live in a racist culture that I have not before seen in the way that I do now, I then take away that like me versus them. And so hopefully I'm saying to them that if they view that they have had similar experiences I have or vice versa, then they might see themselves in my own experience so that I'm embracing. Because the one thing I wanted to point out in that question is to remind us all that we all have the racial bias because we are all inherited this structure. And so even if I'm white and I feel like I've read White Fragility and I might be longer on the continuum, I'm still in ways I don't yet understand perpetuating a racist system and still benefiting from it. So even if I'm white, I don't point the finger and say, oh, that person is racist and not me. Like we're all part of it. We all have a role and we've all been complicit unwittingly nonetheless. So I think if we start, for me, it's been helpful to start just from when I say how my experience has been or how I view it, that then takes the target off of the other person and they can open up a conversation.
I will add to Kris here. As part of our equity and inclusion journey at CLF, we've also taken time to invest in just our culture at CLF. And part of that training has been how to have crucial conversations, right, or critical conversations with staff members. And those don't always have to be about race, right? They can be about a variety of different issues, but having the tools and the training to be able to feel empowered to have those conversations and that you're prepared to have those conversations, but also that there has been a structure set up within the organization about how you should approach, right? Who should these questions be approached with, right? If you have a conversation with a supervisor and the supervisor maybe didn't take the feedback as well, right? What is the next step in your structure as an organization? If it's, the executive director, does that then go to the board chair? If it was the board chair, who then do you talk to, right? Making sure that you have those feedback loops set up so that when something comes up, you're not also figuring out the structure and how to have a conversation that you really don't want to have, because none of us want to have that conversation, right? Because we all like being comfortable, and that's going to force us all to be in an uncomfortable position. So make it easier for yourselves by setting up some sort of structure, some sort of feedback loop so that it's not something out of the blue or out of the norm. It becomes easier to have those conversations.
I have another question here, but Elyane, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that or we can move on to another question.
I think Jocelyn covered it mostly. I was going to emphasize how this work is inextricably linked to organizational effectiveness and the investment that we put into our staff and leadership and individuals as leaders and representatives of your organizations. Having the skills to be able to have those critical conversations and to be able to, while also willing to be an ally, I think is a perfect combination of how something like that, addressing a partner or addressing another organization who might be racist. It's a great way to tackle that.
Thank you. We have a question from Kyle, kind of a two-part question, but I want to answer the first part by actually bringing on Maricela and Berta, two of our newer staff members, to help answer this question. So the question is, do you have any advice on how to avoid tokenizing a BIPOC person or community? And I think this hits a lot at the core of, you know, we want to bring on people who are representative of our community, but often there's the fear that, oh, we can't just bring on this one person because we might be tokenizing them and they might not appreciate it. And I wanted to bring Berta and Maricela on to answer this question because they are our two newest hires here at CLF. And while we're not perfect in how we onboard, I think the best advice or best answer we can get to that question is, you know, just honestly coming on to CLF, what were the ways that you were onboarded that made you feel welcome but not tokenized? What tasks were you given that showed your worth and intelligence and passion and not just the color of your skin or the zip code you grew up in? And again, I realize I'm putting both of you on the spot with this question, but Berta, Maricela, if either of you have any insight on an answer to that, I think that answers the question more than maybe a document we can push out.
Thanks for putting us on the spot, Andres. I think something very important was that from the very beginning, from like seeing the job position that I was applying to, it was very clear that equity and inclusion and access were pillars for CLF, and that was very encouraging because I was like, great, I don't have to explain anything to anybody. But I have felt very supported in all my work so far with CLF, and I think having there's an ease where I can approach anybody in the team and have conversations relevant to equity and access and not feel like I'm the one pushing for those conversations. I think they come out very organically. And so I think having that open environment for conversation is very important. I've also been very impressed with the work that CLF has done prior to me coming into the organization.
Hi, everyone. This is Maricela. To answer that question of avoiding tokenizations of BIPOC communities and individuals, I think that's just a hard place to navigate. I've been in the outdoor industry well over 10 plus years, and I've seen it change, and there's been hiccups and just big bumps on the road, but it keeps on moving forward, and these conversations are never easy to have. When I was looking at the description of the job, for me, DEI initiatives are important to me individually as a person, because I am a woman of color, and I do understand that there's a lot of disparities just being a woman of color. In the environmental world, it's even harder to get jobs in this space because of historically what it's been presented to all of us as. But overall, you know, the questions that CLF asked me during the interviews, I think were really important to kind of see who I was as an individual. And my research of the organization really helped solidify my desire to be a part of this space. And I also asked questions during my interview of, you know, what is company culture? Is DEI important? Can you give me examples of the work that you've done? And that really showed to me the importance of DEI initiatives within CLF's core mission, from the board level all the way to, you know, my position. And, you know, with the rigorous interview, you know, I do appreciate it that it was that way, because it really showed that they were really looking for an individual that really fit into their core values. And since I've been in the position, you know, the books that they offer, Positive Intelligence, How Your Story Sets You Free, White Fragility, all these books really set a tone to the company culture, and it's appreciated. And I always say that to everyone when we have our meetings, because our conversations are genuine and authentic and real, and it's a safe space for all of us to really express how we feel. And that goes to show that everyone really does care about one another, and they really do want to push forward on DEI initiatives. And they're not a performative organization. They're an actionable, authentic organization that really wants to do better for the internal organization, as well as the FGN network, and even to the way that they provide funding and how they have relationships with their grantees. I think that just sets a tone for anyone who interacts with CLF. And for me, it's it's definitely a new world seeing it in the conservation realm, because since I've been in the outdoor industry, you don't really see that with nonprofit or non-for-profit organizations and businesses. You know, there's a lot of work to be done, and it can't just be in a vacuum. It can't be one organization doing one thing and another doing something else. It has to really be in a collective mindset that we all want to move forward and elevate these marginalized voices, as well as voices that have not really been listened to, as we understand that all of these systematic issues are all interconnected. So the tokenization part it's going to be a difficult task. I don't think there's one right way to really handle it, but at the end of the day, when you are offering a position to someone, you know, pay them for what they're worth, and allow them to grow professionally by providing resources to them to grow, to go to different events, to gain more skills, to allow them to speak their truth, and also take that in as a moment for you to also grow in that space, and to understand that no one mindset is the right mindset. It's a collective mindset makes a better mindset overall.
Andres, can I jump in with one thing to follow on with Marcella? Two pieces to this. So one is I want to share just how I'm learning every day as a communications professional in this, because part of the second piece as I'm reading that question was about how to not tokenize in our communications and our visuals and what we use, but how do you build the assets? You know, you want to be supportive, but you don't want to tokenize in that space. And I participated in I listened into a webinar yesterday by the Communications Network. And so for any of the communications folks or otherwise people interested here and aren't familiar with the Communications Network, it's a tremendous asset, a place of resources and sharing of ideas around communications. And yesterday's it was called Communicating Equity When the World is on Fire. And I just call that out because I think it'd be worth listening into. But one of the things there, and it touches on this about building up the assets, it's, you know, first is, again, don't not do something because you don't stop progress because you're uncertain of the process. If your attention is there, start to utilize different voices, profile them, highlight them. And integrate them. I mean, I go down to the operational level when I look at a content for the month, let's say, of my social channels, how I will look through a filter of, have I created racial equity? Have there been a number of voices? So I go through and make that mental and programmatic check. But one of the things that was brought to my attention through yesterday's webinar that I wanted to share was the value of, or looking into paying people for their intellectual capital. So not just seeking, like I'm now going to be looking into this more clearly with the rest of our team, but we have, you know, obviously the great benefit with all of our friends groups and the diversity within our groups to be able to call upon you and say, oh, it's Asian American Appreciation Month. You know, we'd love to get a blog post from, you know, someone representative of that community and their experience. And we still are going to continue to do that, not just that month, but every month, right? Because we should be celebrating everybody's history every month. But I'm now wanting to look into how do we compensate people for their intellectual capital and what they're providing to us and the value they provide. So are we paying people for blog posts? Are we going to, you know, carve out budget for a photo essay of somebody, you know, in a particular place? So in addition to what Marcella brought up in terms of, you know, paying everybody their value from a communication standpoint, now at CLF, I want to be looking into how do we compensate people who are helping to create the change we need and compensating them for it.
Thank you, Kris. And we are almost about a minute out here from the end. So I will just say that I know there's more questions. Bertha sent the Slack channel link. We'll send it in the follow-up notes. So let's continue the questions and conversation on that Slack channel, kind of moving forward, knowing that this is a journey. And I will hand it over to Andres to wrap up for us here. And thank you all for your time today and your questions.
Yeah, thank you everybody on the panel, all my colleagues and everybody who joined us. And I do want to give a big shout out to Beth Poole, who is not on the screen here, but is furiously copy and pasting all this information so that we can follow up in an appropriate way. So thank you, Beth, even though we don't see you on the screen. This is not the conversation. This is just one of the conversations we're going to need to have. For some people, this may be the first step, and that's okay. For some people, they might be a few steps ahead. That's wonderful. Some folks may think they're at the finish line. They're not. We're all continuing on this. It doesn't end. But what I do want to do is welcome everybody to be in this together. I hit on this point earlier, and I want to hit on it again, that this can't be something that a few groups shine and stand out front and we look at them and say, ooh, we want to do that. We as a network really need to all move forward together on this so that we're not just individual organizations doing really good stuff in the world. We are a network for change, all marching together forward. And in that way, we're helping each other, pulling each other forward. Those who are a few steps ahead can provide some maps on how to step forward a little bit easier. Those who are a little bit further behind can access the resources of groups that are already doing it well and pull themselves forward. And if we do that all together, we're changing the culture, not just of nonprofits in the conservation community, but what it means to be advocates for our community and our landscapes at the same time. So again, these conversations will continue. We'll be putting out a few more webinars and community conversations related to this. So please look forward to that in your email. If you want to register for it or pass it on to other people in your organization, please do. If you have any questions about it, you can always reach out to me or anybody at CLF. Please use Slack. We're setting this up so that we can continue these conversations in real time. Please sign up. If you're not using Slack, do it. It's wonderful. And again, please continue to educate yourselves. And don't just rely on the resources that we provide. Share resources with us. If we're all going to do this together, we're going to rely on you as much as you may be relying on us at times. And if we can all embody that and move forward together, we are going to do some really good change in the world. We're going to create a just society. And at the same time, we're going to have land that is protected for all the right reasons. So let's continue to do that. I look forward to seeing all of you in person when we can do that. For now, keep being awesome. You keep us stoked each and every day to do the good work. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And with that, we'll end. Enjoy your afternoons, everybody, wherever you are. Bye.